Hello, Houston. We're going to finish our discussion today of long-term memory, and the information that we cover today, everything completed today, will be included on the first exam in the course, as it will traditionally be done from now on. And in fact, it will include all of long-term memory, which I'm going to finish today. I'm under a little personal pressure because in the past we've had the luxury of being able to dribble over from one lecture into the next. Don't have that luxury this time. We need to start and finish what we're going to try and cover today. So in essence, basically, we know that the onrush of continuing incoming stimuli forces our brain in some way to move to encode. That is, you have to, given the experiences you're participating in one way or another, you've got to encode it. And so for long-term memory, the storage of incoming stimuli is really crucial. The brain has to form some kind of a different configuration because what's coming in are images or oral sounds and so forth and so on. We simply have to make adjustments. If you think about it, we're living really in a constantly changing array of stimuli. Some are controlled, but many of them, most of them, are not. We don't control what's happening in the environment around us. And because of that, the onrush of stimulation is in fact, some would argue, the source of iconic or sensory memory. It's nothing more than the incoming stimulation that constitutes our experience of short-term memory. Our long-term memory is in the background, against which we do things like perceiving, we organize stuff, we interpret it, and indeed our entire experience is really founded on the long-term memories that we're drawing on, so we can put our daily lives and the information to which we're consistently exposed into the context of the stored information in our long-term memory. You could think of it essentially as our accumulated wisdom, and it provides a context within which to judge our current experience. Iconic memory, short-term memory, however you want to define it, is here and now. Long-term memory, on the other hand, is the storehouse of knowledge in terms of which we interpret the flood of stimuli that are hitting on us all the time. So where iconic or short-term memory you can think of as immediate or active, and in fact that is the fundamental definition of those, long-term memory is of unspecified permanence, but that can in fact be measured, and we're going to look at some of the attempts to do that today. Let's first of all look at the locations and the operations that are performed in trying to formalize these memories, these incoming events for purpose of storage. So what we're going to look at today on the screen is essentially location and storage in long-term memory. Starting out with the location of long-term storage, to answer the question, we have to rely on, for instance, EEG recordings of electrical activity in a given area of the brain. When you're asked about something, does a given area of the brain react or not? We also, as you'll remember in our earlier reviews, can rely on PET scans for measuring brain activity at a particular time, and various other measures, all of which, or many of which we reviewed several lectures ago. And we also have to look at the kinds of hindrances of performance that occur if we lose brain function. And that can happen in a variety of ways, as you'll remember. Injury is one. Illness can in some cases disable or destroy part of our brain. Operations of it can significantly, or I should say operating on the brain, lesioning it essentially, can also destroy areas of it with various intended or unintended side effects. Senses we've already talked about include things like vision, which we know is processed, and visual memories seem to be stored in the occipital cortex. Remember where that is? Lower back of the brain is the occipital cortex. Processing of incoming stimuli seems to be stored there, and the evidence suggests indeed that visual memories are also stored there when the interaction with that is strictly visual. Hearing, of course, is processed, and oral memories, AURAL memories, seem to be stored in the temporal lobe. If you think of the overall picture of the brain as kind of a boxing glove, the temporal lobe, you'll remember, is the thumb of that overall model. That being, I can't do it from here, but essentially the temporal lobe is out along here on this side of the brain. So hearing and all of the oral memories are processed in the temporal lobe, we know that, and they also tend to be stored there. But it's not that simple, if you think about it a second. Because in essence, the model would suggest that while pure sensory experiences are processed in the areas I've just discussed, consider the process like listening, which is processed in the oral area of the brain, nonetheless involves other areas when we hear a word that we may not know. Okay? There are multitudinous possible explanations for what goes on in the brain at that point. For instance, in thinking about the word that I just used, the complex, deep, additional, or different processing that involves finding the meaning of that word activates the frontal lobe. So we really can't say that just listening to what I'm saying involves simply the temporal lobe of your brain. That brain, in turn, as necessary, pulls in other areas of the brain. And so in essence, when we go back to the screen, we can see that forming memories in the initial short-term activity involves three different activities. First, areas, I should say. One is the hippocampus. The second is the thalamus. And the latter area, which is involved, or areas, I should say, are various parts of the adjacent areas of the cortex, adjacent to the oral mode or the visual mode, depending on which you're dealing with there. And yet the hippocampus is not involved in forming long-term memories, which seem processed and stored in the cortex. So the hippocampus is not directly involved in that. But if we look at the basis for long-term storage, the classic view of this is essentially, well, I got ahead of myself here, guess not. Processing basis for storage, essentially. The classic view on that was actually proposed by Donald Hebb, author of one of the two, interestingly enough, one of the two introductory texts to which I was originally introduced by psychology. So his work goes all the way back into the 1950s, but even by then, 60 years ago now, Hebb had already been talking about and proposed the existence of neural circuits which could be activated through rehearsal. Longer rehearsal meant greater likelihood of storage in long-term memory, based on the activity of these self-initiated neural circuits, as he described them. And his initial model was really very simple. Cell A activates cell B, activates cell C, and it was viewed as a closed circuit. But we know that simple repetition doesn't lead to long-term storage. So there has to be something more than just the individual activated circuit. There also has to be, well, for instance, the example I've given you before is that of remembering a telephone number. If you don't intend to remember it, it disappears as soon as you stop rehearsing it. It drops out of short-term memory. But there are changes that can occur during short-term recitation or repetition that do, in fact, lead to long-term storage. Whether it's chemical or neuronal remains to be seen. Being linked to other meaningful information already stored does lead to long-term memory. And I'll have several different comments that tie into that very simple summary statement. But essentially linking what is incoming now, something you're trying to learn or remember, to something you previously know makes the likelihood of being able to remember it much higher. Note then that in an exciting event, for instance, your first kiss that we talked about last time, does not require that active rehearsal. So there have to be other explanations. It isn't simply Hebb's idea of the activated circuit alone, which will lead to long-term memory. Okay? One-trial storage is possible. It happens, particularly when motivation level goes up. And in fact, what seems to happen there is essentially the epinephrine, which we're going to put on the screen here. Epinephrine is secreted under conditions of high arousal. Anytime you get stirred up, your system generates epinephrine. And that in turn has the effect of converting stored energy, specifically glycogen, into glucose to feed the body's muscles. That rise in sugar also aids in storage of memory. The evidence for that goes back about 15, 18 years. We knew by about 1990, McGaw's work, that could be done, that is, as a rise in blood sugar aids the storage of memory. As a diabetic, of course, I'm very interested in that because I do sometimes have high sugar. So if I can store extra knowledge, why not? There is evidence that injecting glucose to raise blood sugar level after an event does improve subsequent recall of details of that event, which leads then to a question regarding, well, okay, where is storage in long-term memory? And it turns out I shouldn't have hit that button yet, so we'll back off that screen for a minute. And basically, the other thing I wanted to review with you was a really nice article done by Gordon Bauer over 30 years ago now. And basically, what he did was to generate a list of the incredible array of things that we actually store in long-term memory. So the question obviously has to do with How do we quantify that? How do we measure what's actually stored in long-term memory? And that may not be an easy question, even a feasible question to answer. But if you think about it for a minute, the model of spatial worlds surrounding us is literally a cognitive map of everything we own or are involved with. Our house, our grocery store, and a representation of how to get from one point to another. A personal GPS is essentially what we're carrying around in our head. I do need to go back to the screen because I want to make one other point. The thing is simply out of order, but I want to make sure that I can give you a list here. So in essence, when we start talking about the processing of information, there are two different responses to where that processing is actually going on. One is that there is generalized activity, that is, various areas of the brain are actively involved simultaneously. But at the same time, there is the issue of specialized processing which is involved. That is, sensory experience, as just noted, involves very specialized processing in specific areas. Storing of long-term memory, however, is not specific. The list I'm going to give you here in just a minute is simply not specific. Notice, for instance, that if you experience somebody with a head injury, you're in an automobile accident, they have you lose a portion of your brain through a destructive hit on the head or something like that. If you think about the loss that occurs for you, it does not cause you to lose the N words, the words that begin with N. It doesn't cause you to lose adjectives. It doesn't cause you to lose any specific element related to words. Adjectives, nouns, verbs, doesn't matter. It's not impacted that way. And in fact, the only demonstrable effect, assuming that normal recovery is achievable, that is, that storage sites are the main thing that were impacted by the loss of head injury, the loss of material, brain material, neural material. In essence, the only major effect of that injury is to slow the processing time. And in essence, you could draw a parallel in that to the complexity of the model or the number of cues that you can collect in when you're looking for a particular word or trying to process an event or a sentence or anything else. That in fact, the evidence regarding the effect of deterioration or destruction of some part of brain tissue is really very clear evidence to the effect that we don't store apple in this spot and orange over here or anything like that. In fact, the words are broken down into their parts, and you'll see when we look at language and use of language later, that memory construction is an active process. When you use a given word, you're pulling together the elements in order to be able to enunciate it, read it, and understand it, and so forth. So in essence, the processing is specialized in certain areas, but things like memory, for instance, seem to involve large areas of the brain. And it's very possible that a given word, as it's divided into, it's a noun, it begins with S, it's got so many letters, so many syllables, and so forth, is actually spread across several different places of the brain. The net result being that if some of that is deteriorated, it doesn't do anything but slow down your processing a little bit. Instead of having 5 cues, pick a number. Instead of having 8 cues to assemble a word, maybe you've got 7. So you have to work just a little harder, come up with the word that you actually need. But that's the only major result of that general kind of destruction of memory storage. So now let's go back to my list here and show you the kind of things that I wanted to talk about. And that was essentially, well, we're going to do a couple of different things here, I guess. And epinephrine I've already talked about. Glycogen I've talked about. Generalized, oh, that's what I did. I slipped. I should have erased that previous slide. Sorry about that. Now we're going to get to what I was going to say. And that is issues related specifically to storage. And what Bauer basically did was to mention 5 or 6 really kind of broad but challenging categories that we have to be able to handle in our overall description of long-term memory. And that is, first of all, we carry around, as I said a minute ago, a model of our spatial world. That is, I gave an example a couple of weeks ago that somebody blew because they already knew the room too well, that in fact you could shut your eyes, if you think about it, when you're sitting in a studio or sitting where you are at home, you could shut your eyes, get up and go to the refrigerator essentially without having to look. You know that area well enough that you can do that. You have in your head a model of the environment of which you are a part. A second thing that you have in that head of yours, is knowledge about the physical aspects of our environment. This includes, for instance, how to hold a glass of water without spilling it. You know, there are certain rules that are involved. And in fact, if you tip it in various ways, there are all sorts of ways to spill the fluid, but there are fairly simple rules to operate so that you can carry it from a given place to another without leaving a trail of fluid from one spot to the other. You know how to pour it, the fluid, from one vessel into another. You know how to drink from the vessel. There are all sorts of rules related to operating the physical aspects of our environment. It's easy enough to do. A third thing that we have is essentially knowledge of people. In that case, what we're doing is including not only our own inabilities, but also how to interact with other people in terms of their abilities and inabilities. We all have shortcomings. We also concentrate on and are aware of a function of the purpose of their relationship to us and our relationship to them. That is, we know the ground rules by which to interact with people. We'll talk about that a little bit more later when we look at communication. But for instance, you know that when you're walking across campus with somebody that you're very much in love with, it doesn't bother you at all to touch one another. That's part of the goal of being in love. But in essence, you wouldn't walk in the same way next to a professor. There's a barrier between professors and students for several different reasons, ethically, but specifically emotionally. You know that. I know that. And it just governs the way how far we stand from each other. It's just among the rules that are involved in that knowledge of people and how we interact with people as a function of their role and so forth. Another element that we look at involves the ethics or the values that we hold and the things that that are most important to us in our career and our personal goals. All of those are also stored in our long-term memory. Fifth, we also have various knowledges of motor skills, such as walking, swimming, and bicycling, the traditional elements that are cited for procedural memory, for instance, using one model of storage. But we've also got the problem-solving skills related to each of those different activities. If you know somebody who works on cars, that toolbox represents various kinds of, literally, tools, which cue them to all sorts of different kinds of activities. You use one tool for scraping stuff, you use another for hammering it, yet another for twisting it, as in with a screwdriver or something like that. All of those motor skills are up here in the head of a mechanic. And then finally, essentially, all of our perceptual skills, whether visual, for instance, in reading, or musical appreciation at a concert, all of that is involved and stored among the skills involving perception and how we conduct each of those different activities. So specific processing is involved in those various kinds of sensory elements, but the storage of long-term memory is not specific, it's generalized. And that was kind of the general point I wanted to make. The order was a little messed up, but that was the fundamental point to make in this instance. Let me remind you here that we can also come back and talk a little bit about the importance of codes. Remember, in our earlier discussions, we dwelled in the importance of encoding as we experience something in order to facilitate retention. It's widely agreed across a broad array of research that, in fact, those codes are of one of three forms. One is semantic, meaning-based. A second is oral. For instance, if you think about it, if somebody breaks out into Auld Lang Syne, you can at least mumble your way through the first chorus, you know, the general structure of that song, and yet, having mentioned it at this time of the year, you can probably count the months from here back to January 1st, and that's probably the first time you've thought about Auld Lang Syne as a song since the 1st or 2nd of January, because that's when we traditionally sing that particular song. And yet that's a code that is largely stored in the oral portion of our memory. And then finally, of course, the codes are also visual. We can recognize someone with whom we have not been in touch for months, and in fact, I'm going to show you a really classy explanation of that a little bit later, a demonstration of it a little bit later, indeed years in some cases. You may have a special aunt or an uncle who, for a variety of reasons, you haven't seen in 2 or 3 or 4 years. They've been overseas or they've moved out of Texas or anything like that. But the image of that person is roughly analogous to the example I gave you the other day of give me your third association to an animal or anything like that. It's a recall cue that allows you very easily to call up any related information. And that recall activates a search in semantic storage in addition to the, what was his name? You're searching through semantic effects there. The visual image, you see a picture, and you're trying to recall the name that goes with it, there's a case where there's a link between those two different areas. But the question then is essentially looking at the next feature we're going to look at, which is essentially organization, okay? And what that has to do with is the fact that the nature of the search that we make in our long-term memory makes it obvious that our long-term memory, the stuff we have stored in the head of each of us, is in fact organized. Salso has suggested that if you try to recall what you're doing on a day in your more distant past, I won't give you a specific date to do that because these lectures, of course, are timeless. We can live with that myth. But let me try it this way. Rather than giving you a specific day which becomes dated in the onrush of television, try it this way. What were you doing 2 years ago today? And if you try to recall that, there are certain strategies that you are very likely to use. Studies have been done on this in which people do the recall and then they actually recite the sequence by which they jump from point to point to point. It might be related to your wedding. Maybe that occurred 2 years ago today, or the weekend before 2 years ago today. Was it your birthday? Were you involved for the U of H in a soccer game or a debate of some sort? Were you at a friend's wedding on this weekend? And can you back off from that to discover what you actually were doing 2 years ago today? Do you always go with somebody downtown, anywhere, on this particular day or a day like this one? One of my favorite examples of that is a longtime author in the Houston Post and now Chronicle, and that is Leon Hale, who's been around seemingly forever. He's well into his 80s now. And yet up until quite recently, he and a friend every year would take a drive south. About this time of year, they would simply leave Houston in a car driving south, and the theoretical goal was to find spring. They did the journey each year simply to drive down until they ran into spring, and when they found the first open buds, that's where they'd stop, have a beer, reminisce about whatever they found, and so forth. But it was a really nice kind of tale. In that, it represents exactly what I'm talking about, and that is when you think back to where you were on day X or day Y, in Mr. Hale's case, in this time, he could then look back to the various trips that he's taken and recite, well, I was in, name a city and an activity that he probably participated in. But whatever it is, fundamentally, that search is organized. It is not simply a random search across your memory of a past friend, your mother's favorite recipe, the car that you used to drive before the one that you now drive, or anything like that. I mean, if you randomly hopped around your memories, you could spend weeks shopping around from item to item to item. The case is simply documentable that any time we look for a particular piece of information, it's based on an organized search of a known area, our brain. So you take any of those suggestions a minute ago as your starting point. You need to know whether you paid a bill. You can go back and start with your checkbook. Check the date, and that will tell you, among other things, if the bill was paid and when in fact you did so. Or you get monthly items from a credit card. It's the same kind of organized search for payment to a particular company or an activity that you were involved in at any given time. From those documented events, you can basically create an intelligent guess as to what you were doing on this day at some previous time, a year or 2 or 3 years earlier. Later on in our discussion of language, we'll examine in more detail how you may organize your knowledge of, say, for instance, pick a topic, trees, as an example of that. One way in which you divide trees out, or one way to divide them out, is to divide them into simply deciduous and evergreens. And if in turn you take evergreens as a label, you can in turn divide those into general categories like cedars and pines. And there are several others of the evergreens that you could mention. And in turn, once you get into particular kinds of pines, you can go from loblolly to the tall, slender ones we grow here in the east of Texas, the name of which I cannot remember. And the list goes on and on and on. But basically what's being suggested there is the organizational scheme. And that is the fact that one of the things we'll look at in some detail a little bit later here is the fact that there's pretty good evidence to suggest that our knowledge of those kinds of facts is networked. It's organized by a network. And I'll show you some rather impressive reaction time data that shows you the closer two terms are likely to be stored to each other, the shorter the reaction time to get from one to the other. So there is good correlational evidence to suggest that that network model is a very likely proposal as to how our knowledge is actually stored. But as we'll see much later, The existence of such networks really has two major benefits. First of all, it makes recall of specific information much easier to do. When you're looking for a particular type of word, there's a subset of words that you go to within which you go to the categories beneath it, and so forth. And secondly, it also makes learning and the storage of the current experience much easier. In other words, if you're linking words to stored networks, it's much easier to store that information away. You don't have to work as hard to shape it up in such a way that you can retrieve it. You link it to other things that you already know. Hence the organization, and hence the idea of a network as one of the bases on which it may be done. So then we come to a rather interesting question. Well, okay, Cashaw, how big is long-term memory? How long does it last? Okay, what's the capacity? What's the duration? Bigness is simply impossible to know, but the efficiency of our memory is prodigious. It's just amazing. We're very good at remembering even minutiae for decades, if it's important to us. My father was one of 3 boys and a girl born to my grandparents, grandfather, grandmother. They lived in Ridgewood, New Jersey. The family always lived in Ridgewood, New Jersey, which is about 15, 20 miles outside, away from the George Washington Bridge, near New York City, where my grandfather was a composer and teaching musician through his lifetime. And they never moved through the whole time. They simply lived in Ridgewood, New Jersey. So I've seen where the event I'm about to describe actually happened. Their house was up on a hill, maybe half a mile from the railroad tracks coming out from New York City. And one day, walking home from the train station where they had been visited, where they'd been dropped off on the train because they had been into New York, a car drove up a steepish hill, separating the hill rose from the railroad tracks up toward the residences which were on top of the hill and thus sheltered from the noise and everything. And my father and his brother, my uncle, were in fact walking up that hill when a car kind of came a little bit uncomfortably close to them as it was rolling up the hill, as they were walking up the hill and it was driving up the hill. And they got to talking about it, and my brother challenged my father challenged his brother, my uncle, to name the license plate. Could he recall the details? They were talking about, what if an accident had happened? Would we have been able to remember this, that, and the other thing? And they challenged each other, and they agreed on what the license plate of that car was. 2 letters and 3 numbers at that time in New Jersey. It's a lot more complex now than it used to be. But they teased and tested each other about that thing because one of them laid a challenge on the other one, which said, well, in fact, it was my father, if I remember the tale correctly, challenged my uncle with the fact that I'm going to remember that longer than you do. I'll remember it better than you do. And I only saw them interact with that twice. I heard the tale once about how the thing had been established. I only saw them interact with that twice. The second time, my father, by that time, was 76, 2 years before his death, and my uncle was several years older than that and died actually shortly after this event. But one of them challenged the other, bet you can't remember, and sure enough, the memory was still there. And by the time that event occurred, that challenge, it was over 60 years since the original event had taken place. And of course, there's no way directly to prove what that license plate was, but the key certainty behind it is the fact that they were in agreement. That is, they had that sequence of letters and 3 numbers exactly in agreement, and the demonstration of it is the fact that they recited it simultaneously. Once the challenge was laid out in unison, they both laid out, I have no idea what it was, wasn't my challenge, but the 2 years and the 2 letters and 3 numbers came out simultaneously with each other. And I can guarantee you that that was the correct answer, because both of them were stubborn enough that if one of them had blown it, the other would have claimed victory. There's no doubt. So we can pretty well confirm the accuracy of that particular memory. But capacity, there's just no obvious way to establish, given current technology. We just can't answer specifically how much information is actually stored in our head. Some of it's pretty trivial. Other parts of it are very crucial. The name of your teachers, the name of your friends. You've got to know those when you pass people in the hallway. I turn out to be lousy at that, so I mumble about good morning or good evening or how are you, but you don't hear me use names very often. I'm more interested in talking about the subject than rehearsing people's names. So that's not a strength in my particular character, but it's an acknowledged error, and it traces simply from the fact that I don't rehearse it. When I meet somebody, I say back their name, and then if I remember it, that's great, but I'm more interested in the subject of the conversation. But think about it. Can you recall the name of your second grade teacher? Can you recall that person's name? Because right now, given that most of you are juniors or seniors in this class, you're removed from it for probably 14 years minimum from the experience with that individual. Can you still name that him or her? More likely her than him at that time. How many people can name their second grade teacher? Okay, could you do it? Is there anybody that couldn't do it instantly?
I can't do it at all.
Can't do it at all. You're no help. Okay, but nobody else had to take 2 or 3 minutes, no, 2 or 3, several seconds to think of what that name was. On the microphone, could you describe just for a second what was the sequence that you went through to get to that particular name? Do you remember was there a series of events that you went back through?
I started to think of like 5th grade, 4th grade, like thinking backwards for some reason.
Backward through elementary school. Okay. Alrighty. Well, in essence, that was kind of a surprise trick, and I'm not asking you to record any details on it, but when people have investigated that, it turns out that there is a fairly consistent logic by which you can get back to something that you can't instantly recall. Okay? That in fact the sequencing by which we do it, for instance, it is very hard, to give you an example of what I'm driving toward here, it is very hard for me to just say to you, think of something you haven't thought about in 20 years. Or 10 years, or any given time. It's very difficult to do that without going through essentially what she was describing, and that is you start somewhere, given the subject, you start at a point, and you work point for point, that is topic to topic, or association to association, backward, till you get to the fact that you actually need. I'll show you some other examples of that here in just a minute. But right now, let's look at another absolutely fascinating area called very long-term memory. And in fact, I've emphasized that because in this case, what singles this out for particular concentration is the fact that we're really talking about months, indeed years, of storage of certain kinds of information. The person who's done this is Harry Barrick and a number of his colleagues, starting back at Ohio Wesleyan University in 1975. He started a fascinating examination of what some have called VLTM, and that seems to be a label that has stuck, very long-term memory. I've seen another word starting to show up in the literature, and that is permastore. But I kind of like, in some ways, VLTM as a better reference to the kind of the extended version of what we've already been talking about here. And the results that he got are truly astounding. I'll get to those in a minute. But with recall intervals that range from 3.3 months, that is, say 13 weeks, up to 47 and a half years, 47 years, 7 months, actually, across 9 different groups of recall. What Barrick did was to assess high school graduates' memories for high school events and people, both their names and their pictures, their faces, in other words. There were a variety of different tasks that they did in this situation. But essentially, they went back to the graduates of recent and further back classes, severalfold, and organized groups, in some cases, of almost 50 of the graduates that they were able to track down. So what these graduates were asked to do, related to the people and their names, was 6 different types of tasks, 2 of which I'm going to show you here. But one of them was that they were asked to simply free recall the names of everybody that they could think about, everybody they could remember from their graduating class. Okay, so they had to free recall a name. Second thing they had to do was to demonstrate facial recognition, demonstrate a photo of that particular person. Okay. Thirdly, they had to demonstrate name recognition using the same procedure. That is, a selection of names. They had to be able to pull out the ones that they did actually remember. Fourthly, they were given a task where they had a collection of names, they had a collection of pictures. And in fact, what they had to do was pair them, kind of like a reverse paired associate test in some ways. Another was to reverse that. They had to match pictures to names. And then finally, they had to recall a name from the picture. So they were given all sorts of different links between the visual image of what the person looked like and the name that was properly associated with that particular individual. Let me show you a plot of 2 different items here, and let me see if this is where I want to go directly here right at the moment. Let me hang on a second. There are 2 other things I want to do. What I am going to show you, first of all, is name recall, how accurate they were at doing that. Pure free recall, which is what's involved there. up to 46, 47, 48 years later, and then also picture recognition for all 9 of the groups. The task here had the original sample from Rutherford B. Hayes High School in Delaware, Ohio. How they came up with that name, I don't quite know. I guess it was reminiscences of a state 1 or 2 to the east. But in any case, it was Delaware, Ohio, where Ohio Wesleyan is located. And what they did was to draw a similar sized sample from a neighboring school. So they were working, Barrick was working with the high school in the town that Ohio Wesleyan is located in. I actually looked that up, and it is actually Rutherford B. Hayes High School, and I'll have some comments about that in a minute, because that puts certain kinds of limits on the kind of conclusion that he's reached. But in essence, what they did to create the name lists and the photos, the images to be remembered, was that they had a group of stimuli from the actual high school graduating class. And then what they did was go to a neighboring town, also in Ohio, so the clothing style was roughly the same, on the same year, so that the style itself was the same. And they drew another sample of a comparable number of people from the high school that was involved there. So now let me show you the data that was actually discovered in this case. And it looked like this. Okay, if we plot here percentage correct on the left side and plot the length of retention in years, what I've done here is to convert each of that was actually done in months. And let me point out here before I show you the curve that there are a couple of things to keep in mind here, and that is that the step interval is very uneven. Okay, that's about a 4-month difference between the first 2, and yet we've got a 14-year difference between the last 2. So don't get hung up on the grid itself. But there is one feature that I want to show you here, and this is what it looks like in terms of picture recognition. Okay, well, there's a sharp decline in recognition that began to occur after 34, 35 years. We might attribute that to nothing more than a degenerative process of age, the encroaching effects of Alzheimer's or various kind of recall difficulties that may occur. And the free recall data should probably not be particularly surprising. It's lower, and in fact declines further and a little bit faster. But in essence, if you look strictly at the recognition data, that meant that in fact they were able to look at pictures of people they had graduated with in the intervals that can be seen there as much as 3.5 decades later, and they're still up at the 90th percentile in terms of recall. The figure is actually above, well, it's in the high 90s, I should say low 90s, high 80s, almost all the way across there. A little bit of variation with a couple of the classes are a little more challenged. But the recall is just absolutely impressive for faces. That's images that are recalled in that. And then recognize also a couple of different things here, and that is that the population in that town is somewhere between 25 and 32,000. I couldn't, when I was scanning the internet the other night, I could not find a specific figure tying this is how big Delaware was on that day, the town of Delaware, Ohio. But the town itself was only 25 to 30,000. Now it's grown of late years. It seems to be growing, unlike many parts of Ohio, but it was growing. But so you assume even maybe the original town was 25, perhaps 20,000. That's been a relatively stable area. But let's in turn think about the high school class in that situation. I'm going to show you some more data here, and that looks at specifically what that high school looks like. And let's just make an arbitrary assumption here. We do know the figure that I did find is that a recent class, just within the last 2 or 3 years, had a total of 750 people in it. So if we assume, and it's likely a generous estimate, that there were 750 people in that school, I'm talking about, not the class, we might say, assuming the people do drop out of high school, as they do, that might be a reasonable estimate of the number of people in school right now as a function of freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. And you add in the fact that the town was smaller at the time the study was done, and you're looking at a total sample of perhaps 150, maybe even as low as 100 to 125 graduating seniors. Okay? So it's a fairly small sample, and to end up with the recall data that we did in terms of percentages, what I'm basically suggesting is that the challenge is not quite as impressive as it looks, because there was a limited number of people that you were trying to deal with. I have a summer home in upstate New York, a home that I vacation at in the summer, and the closest town is only about 6,000 people. And you go in and talk to anybody, and everybody knows everybody. And I'm sure that's not totally the case when the town grows to 4 or 5 times that big, but it's an element you have to consider. And that is that there may have been over-rehearsal is part of what I'm arguing here. But in fact, if one of the other things I'm trying to give you several different elements to explain the data that we get there. But I just went to my 50th high school reunion this past summer. And in that case, I looked at the data in terms of who was there. And our graduating class was over 500 people. It was a large city school in Schenectady, New York. And in that case, in our case, the class, about 40% of the people showed up at the 20th. And that was an interesting exercise because everybody was all full of themselves and demonstrating how rich they were and how good and successful and so forth among the crew that showed up there. About a third showed up at the 30th reunion, and only 15% showed up at the 50th. So essentially for the 50th reunion, we only had 75 out of 500 people who were actually there. And so what I'm suggesting is there is kind of a drop-off in the exposure to each of the people that these graduates were able to remember. And yet it seems pretty clear in looking at the recall curve that the facial recognition, the visual image, seems to be more permanently stored even than the names. And in fact, the only way that image would be refreshed is if you spend time with that person. Names, on the other hand, you could think about. Maybe you sit and look at the yearbook occasionally. I know some memory-based people tend to do that. But in fact, there are significant reasons to still be impressed with the 90% recall of people with whom they had graduated as much as 47 years earlier. That's quite an impressive feat. So facial recognition of former classmates was approximately 90%, even 34 years after graduation, and still at 75%, even significantly after that, almost 50 years. So recognition memory of visual images seems to be almost invariant. But the question that we're left with then is, well, okay, what does cause forgetting? And I want to go back and review with you in this context some data that we've looked at, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but one study that tried to answer that question way back in 1924 was done by Jenkins and Dallenbach. And what they did in that study was to have undergraduates learn a 10-item list of nonsense syllables to one perfect recitation. And then they were released from the laboratory. Sorry, back that up. In one case, the group learned the list at about 11:30 at night, and then they went to bed and slept. And in that case, they were awakened 1, 2, 4, 6, or 8 hours later and asked to recall the list. Speaking of memory or lack of it, there were some of the people the next morning who swore they'd never been awakened. They did not remember at all that they had been awakened during the night to participate and recall. But the data there, after they've been sleeping, is pretty straightforward as to what it implies, and that is you haven't been using it, you haven't learned any additional information or recalled stuff in the meantime, so it's pretty obvious that would be described by decay. That is, it's the loss of information through disuse. The information is just not being used when you're sound asleep. But look at this. When they were released from the lab, if they learned the information earlier in the day, then what was found was that when they were called back, again, 1, 2, 4, 6, or 8 hours later, the recall had dropped substantially, so that it was down to right around 10% after only 8 hours. Learn it at 9 in the morning, and by 5 in the afternoon, your recall is down to about 10% of the list, one item out of the 10 that you originally mastered. The initial reaction to this was, well, it's obviously decay, and people kind of shut the book and went away from that for many years. But then all of a sudden, somebody looked at that curve and came to the realization, well, wait a minute, yeah, there's a loss over time, but the much more impressive fact of that data is the whopping difference over the same amount of time in the situation where you're active, that is, where you're actively processing information during the retention interval. And that led to a very different model. But what that model was essentially saying is, no, it isn't decay. And we've talked about this once before. Let me just review that for you. And that is that anybody that farms will tell you that it isn't simply the passage of time that causes erosion, which a farmer always has to deal with. It is rather the effects of wind or rain. Those are the major sources of the loss of soil. So in essence, It is an interference model that really is being suggested instead here. And the loss of information through disuse does not allow for the effects of incoming or previously learned information. The decay model doesn't handle either prior learning or subsequent learning. An interference model does. And this is the model. I'm going to fill in one other element here to complete our tour of this particular model here. But let me just review with you that in this particular model, what we're looking at is a sequence where time 1 and time 2 represent when you learn something, and time 2 is when you're going to recall it. And then relative to those two key events, initial learning and ultimate use or recall, there are two types of learning or activity that can hinder that. The one is any previous learning that you've done, earlier learning, prior even to the original learning. And that in turn, if that works to the detriment of the learning and retention of the time 1 element, then what you're attributing that to is what's called proactive or forward-acting interference. The pro references forward-acting in that case. And so any evidence where the prior learning hinders your subsequent learning is the result of proactive interference, forward-acting interference. The other possibility, however, is what is the effect of the learning that goes on during the time when you're supposed to be remembering that information that you learned to one perfect recitation or whatever. And in that case, if that interferes, hinders your ability to recall the original learning at a later time, then we have the evidence of, or a demonstration of what is called retroactive or backward-acting interference. Okay? And so those are the two major things. PI is proactive, RI is retroactive interference when we're trying to learn something and then recall it later. And I'm going to offer a very specific study of that and suggest the following as a model. And it's obviously a make-do model, an ersatz model here for us. But let me suggest the following. Suppose that you grew up in a home where Spanish was the primary language that is spoken. So your knowledge of Spanish is, that is your native language. You speak it fine. If during, well, let me back up a little bit. For the purposes of the model, let's assume that you also know English, that somehow magically you gained that. But the purpose of the demonstration here, Spanish was what you studied in, let me pack that up, I screwed up the model. Assuming English is your native language, we'll get it right eventually. Suppose you studied Spanish in high school. That was your first exposure to Spanish. And in fact, you learned it at that time. I'd like to keep the graph on the screen, please. In turn, during college, you learned German, okay? And then during the retention interval, you got an avocational interest in French. You decided you like language, so you go take some of the courses that are offered through distance education in French. So in high school, you learned Spanish. In college, you learned German. And then in the intervening time, you've been picking up French. So let's say you're 3 or 4 years past entry into college and several years past your study of German. Now, all of a sudden, the opportunity to go to Germany for Berlin for the summer occurs. And the question then is, what's set up here naturally is a very specific test of the relative impact of proactive versus retroactive interference. Okay, because the question is going to be, if you're standing there in Berlin trying to remember the name for bathroom in a question, which language, if any, interferes, does actually interfere? And in that particular case, the answer is quite clear. And that is Spanish will be the language that gives you the greatest difficulty. Okay, if you've had that as your prior experience to original learning, your attempt to recall that original learning results from proactive interference. It is a strong proactive interference effect. And I can document this in another couple of ways. Okay? And this is a study. I'll show you the results because it's going to take a minute to actually describe what was involved here. Well, I won't show you the results. I'll leave you hanging here for a minute. But this was a study that was done by Benton Underwood. I need to have that image on the screen, please, because I'm lecturing to that. Specifically, what is involved here is a number of subjects. This was an armchair study done by Benton Underwood years ago. All he did one Sunday afternoon, I'm not sure it wasn't just an afternoon, but in a fairly brief period of time, what he did was to go back into the literature of psychology, any study that involved human learning, and he simply asked, what was the recall on the last list learned 24 hours later? So what's summarized here is recall of the last learned list. And the way he divided out the results, the different study results to actually cite here, was by the number of previously learned lists. So in a situation where there's no prior list, the recall interval is simply 24 hours, and it's the number of lists. I notice in looking at the graph here that the label on the bottom is wrong. What that should say is number of lists, not time. Okay, I got all hung up on 24 hours, but in fact, what we're plotting here is time, and the data is quite clear-cut. What you see there is that for any, averaged across several studies, a meta-analysis, for any study where there was a 10 or 12 item word list, I think it was actually held to specifically 10 item lists, if that list was recalled 24 hours later, when it was only the one list, recall was 75 or 80% accurate. But look at that, if there's only 5 lists involved, recall of that last list is already down to 30 or 35%, a whopping drop, and in fact it drops even further. So that if some poor group has had to learn 20 prior lists and then sees the 20th list, there is a whopping proactive interference effect that's going on there. The more prior lists that have been learned, the worse is the effect on ability to retain that last list. If you go back to the graph I was showing you a minute ago, it's very clear that it's prior learning that interferes with our ability to store subsequent learning when there's no easy way to establish a significant linkage. Okay? When there's no easy way to establish a significant linkage. You may be reminded here of the recall lists that you've seen of Ebbinghaus, who had the misfortune of inventing the nonsense syllable, studying it, and then trying to recall lists, 10-item lists of nonsense syllables up to a month later. And in that case, it was the same kind of function that occurred. Remembered days later, or in the hours later, the recall was pretty healthy on the initial list, but the more lists he'd learned in the interval, the worse the recall actually was. So that in this case, we've got a whopping interference effect that's going on. So when we summarize the data here in terms of causes of forgetting, we don't just say interference, we say specifically, and we identify it, proactive interference that is involved here. Okay? There's another element. It isn't quite that clean. And that is, there was a study done by Jenkins. I tried to track down the specific date and I couldn't find it, but I can describe for you essentially what was involved there. What he did was to make a photographic essay of the steps that are involved in making a cup of tea. And he actually developed it into 36 different steps. You have to get the sugar bowl, you have to find the tea, or you have to buy the tea, you have to store the tea, you have to pull the bag out when you're ready to make the cup of tea, and so forth. And he just divided the overall process of making a cup of tea, going to the store to get the thing, everything's stored in the kitchen, you've got to get the pot out, you've got to get the privet on which you heat the pot on the thing so you don't hurt the glass, and so forth. He just did 36 pictures of the overall sequence from starting like, gee, I'd like tea, all the way to the point where you were drinking, the amount of cream that was necessary, the sweetener, and so forth. 36 pictures describing that in a continuous, not confusing, it was just making a cup of tea, start to finish. And what he did then was to actually take 18 of those photos, slides they actually were, and he projected them one at a time at a reasonable rate, 5 seconds a slide, as he described the process of making a cup of tea. 5 seconds a picture, okay? Some degree of interference here, and then, not interference, but activity, another activity. After seeing the 18 slides describing tea, they would put in another activity for a brief period of time to separate them a little bit from immediate knowledge of the recall. It wasn't short term. And then what they did was to give them the entire 36 pictures, random. And the challenge to the subjects was essentially, did you see this picture previously? And what he found was that in general, the pictures that in fact had previously been shown, the 18 that had previously been shown, recall was quite good. What was demonstrated, however, was a whopping interference effect. And that is that a lot of errors were made, 80% errors were made of false positives. Okay, people who looked at other pictures and said, yeah, that was there. And in essence, that's consistent with the model I'm building toward here, which will demonstrate some today and later on in the course we'll demonstrate it in other ways. But in essence, what I'm functionally arguing here is that memory is a reconstructive process. keyword process, it's not active storage of information. Okay, it's not just a storage process, it's a reconstructive process. Okay, let me show you one other factor that does impact our ability to recall information, and that is what's called cue-dependent forgetting. This was originally proposed by Tulving, and he argues in some ways, and we've been around this topic a little bit before, and that is that memories simply may not be forgotten. That is, they're there, but the difficulty we're having is simply not being able to recall the items. Okay? Perhaps they're stored somewhere simply waiting for the proper retrieval call to be able to to be able to reach in. And in that case, forgetting, I should say, becomes essentially a failure to recall. It's not an active process of forgetting. It's simply a failure to recall. That's a different way to envision the process of forgetting. And a failure of a retrieval cue to match the encoding stimulus is a different kind of problem than the loss over time, which is largely disbelieved, or the active interference with an item. Tulving and Pearlstone did a rather interesting study in which subjects were given lists of nouns organized according to categories such as dog, cat, horse, and cow, labeled simply as a domestic mammal category. Half of them were also given a list of category names that represented the specific nouns that had been put within the list. So for instance, if there were specific kinds of pines, pine was one of the cues that was given to them. And the biggest effect of what I'm leading toward was had on the longest list, that is the ones that were harder to categorically organize, that led to or encouraged categorical organization, led to the demonstration of the fact that having those category names increased the recall for the particular types of information that were being recalled. Mammal would be a better recall cue of a category that included mammals than simply being instructed, recall the list. Tell me all the list of words that you saw out of the 20 or whatever it was. Tulving and Sotka demonstrated the same thing in a slightly different way, and this is the data I actually want to show you. In this case, they gave groups of subjects viewed anywhere from 1 to 5 lists, each of which had 24 words in it. So we're looking at a total of 120 words, if you can believe it. And they were shown 3 times per list. They were given anywhere from 1 to 5 lists, 24 words on a list, shown for a specified amount of time, 3 different times on each list. And the lists were composed of 6 sets of 4 words in a given category, like metals. Okay? 10 minutes of a neutral activity, something not involving rehearsal but keeping them busy. And then they were given all of the category names, and they were asked to recall all of the words. So they were shown it in 5 different categories, 5 different lists of categories. But in fact, they recalled it in a different way. And what we'll show you here is the data. And that is essentially that we're going to show you, first of all, the number of words that were recalled and the number of interpolated lists. Okay? That's the original learning, the level to which the original list could be recalled. And the results were rather interesting. If the recall was non-cued, in other words, strictly free recall and nothing else, the item based on prior lists, and we've seen this in the interference effect before, has fallen in this particular study down to about a third, roughly a third of the list could still be recalled. But what's interesting is the cued recall, where they had actually been told, recall the metal names, recall the types of pine, things like that, really had a significant positive contributory effect to recall, suggesting that it's the retrieval cue that we actually need. That's what actually reaches in and impacts our ability to retain information, recall information. The non-cued, let me say it again, the non-cued recall dropped precipitously because of the interpolated lists. But the cued recall is essentially as good as the original learning on the various lists was. It was as strong as the original learning. It's caused by the change in the retrieval information, not because of the memory traces themselves. The information is still there. And then, in fact, I want to go back and look at one other thing that meant to, there were a couple of things about the demonstration of Gordon Bowers suggested by him that I did earlier that I wanted to call back to your attention. And that is, in that case, you'll remember that what I asked you to do was to recall specific lists. Give me a specific association, first, second, or third association to words that I gave you, a random list. And then I asked you to recall your specific response later when I gave you that recall cue. And the difference, as you noted in your own list when you scored against your own answer, was essentially that the words that were being recalled were as different as the people in the studio and the people viewing on the internet or by television. It was a completely different list for each person, which meant specifically that it was personalized. It was your list of information that you were recalling. And when I gave you the very specific retrieval cue, you could then recall quite accurately. The memory was entirely your responsibility, and it turns out it was there. That is, with the retrieval cue, when you needed it, you were able to get back with that retrieval cue to the information. So lest you miss the obvious here, with the material that is made personally meaningful, you can recall it with a substantial amount of information as long as you have a retrieval cue that is properly linked to it. And that may be a major flaw in the tendency of us to forget. I'm skimming ahead here because we're going to run out of time, and I want to make sure I finish all the material here, so pardon my mumbling here for just a second. But in essence, what I'm leading to is something that I put on the screen a little earlier than I meant to. Let's go back to that for a second, and that is the changes in models of memory that have occurred, and it's a change that is continuing. And that is, it's clear that as we look at it, that the earliest models of memory that result all the way back from Ebbinghaus's earliest studies in the late 1885 was his first published work, that memory was, the metaphor that was used for capturing or describing memory was a storehouse metaphor. The idea of Ebbinghaus's model and all the way up through Schneider, Schifrin, and Atkinson and the human associative memory model that they proposed, capacity was the key in that study. How much could you remember? How long could you remember it? And so forth. It was quantitative issues. You'll remember our reference to the impact of Bartlett back in the 30s on our current study of memory, and I'm going to show you Bartlett's study here in a couple of minutes. But it wasn't until Beth Loftus, his study was done in the 30s, but it wasn't until Beth Loftus's work in the 60s and 70s that we began to really recognize what Bartlett had really been telling us, and use Loftus's work to begin to centrally assail the fundamental inaccuracy of recall data when you're talking about eyewitness testimony. And in essence, what we're leading to, and what that work has led to, is what you might call a correspondence metaphor, where accuracy of recall to previous experiences becomes the key element, not the amount you can recall, but the accuracy of what you do recall. And that's really a fundamental shift in the nature. It's really moving toward a word that I've suggested earlier, and that is memory as a process, not simply the storage and passive recall of information. So as such, the increasing emphasis on neuropsychological factors represents another model making its presence known in recent years. That encourages us to look at the relations of our memory phenomena to studies of those with exceptional memories and neurological explanations offered for them. So let's take a look at that. For instance, the idea of mnemonics and the various ways in which that can be done. If we look at mnemonists, you'll see these every now and then on the various Tonight shows. They'll bring in somebody who has met one time all the people sitting in the right-hand section or some subset of the audience. And when the host points, that person, the mnemonist, can look at that person, name their name, where they're from, and maybe even something about what their occupation is. But in essence, a mnemonist is simply someone with an extraordinarily keen memory ability. Luria, back in 1968, reported on a subject who could recall extraordinarily long strings of digits, words, even events, which that person had not experienced, or which he had experienced or been taught as much as 15 or 16 years earlier, and the recall was perfect, was absolutely perfect. The obvious question that Luria asked of that person was, how did you do it? Well, it turned out what he did was convert the experience into another sense. He was engaging in that case in synesthesia, experiencing sensations in a different sensory mode than what is initially stimulating. And that was the way that particular person did it. Hunt and St. Love reported on a participant by the name of VP who converted very long columns or rows of numbers into dates. That was his vehicle. his way of doing it. Erickson, Chase, and Falcon reported on SF, another participant, who converted such numbers into runtimes for various length races, and could not do so when the numbers did not obviously convert into that kind of number. That was kind of the test, the acid test, as to whether that was what he was doing. In each case, what happens is the skilled person in that kind of memory task converts the incoming information automatically, that is without conscious awareness, into a code of events which are meaningful only to the mnemonist. But it aids that recall process, reaching back in and pulling out the information that's needed. DeBaney and all in 2007 actually report that each of us has a stored set of information built around our own interests and skills. For all of us, it's a help to remember something if we can relate it, the incoming information, to stuff that we already know. That goes back to my comments earlier on the networks that are existing in each of us theoretically. Now let's also look at, I'm going to skip the information on flawed amnesic intelligence and look instead at one that I do want to spend a little bit of time on, and that is essentially eyewitness testimony. So pardon me if we have, we'll go directly to that. And I want to cite for you Bartlett's work originally. I do not believe we've actually presented this, but the study I can quickly review for you, and that was, he had two groups of subjects, all of whom were shown original stimuli on 3x5 cards. They were simple line drawings of figures such as what you see there, and that's just a sample of the overall set that he used. But they were shown that, and they were asked to recite, look at the card one at a time and study the card as long as you need until you're able to actually recall and describe for me the shape that was on the particular card. And what is found in that case is that they studied it to one perfect recitation, so they could go through the entire set of information with a recognizable, satisfactory description. And then they're brought back a week later. And kindly, can't trust researchers sometimes, they're kindly offered a series of recall cues. We'd like to have you describe the information we asked you to learn at that particular time. And they were given a series of recall cues. And on the left side, the cues that were given were eyeglasses, pince-nez glasses, the number 2, hourglass, Christmas tree, ship's wheel, and rifle. Just samples. And what for those recall cues, that's a sample of the kind of drawings that you got. Those, you can't directly qualify them or compare them statistically, but look at the kind of recall cues that were given in group 2 with a different set of recall cues. I may have misspoken there. Look at the memories that were recalled with the different set of recall cues, when on the right side, they were told things like dumbbell, the kind of thing you use to strengthen your arm, the number 8, a picnic table, a mason's trowel, the sun, and a pitchfork. Big difference in the recall cues, and you'll notice there's a substantial difference in what's actually recalled. The very nature of recall in this situation, and I'm moving in a slightly different direction for one last point, and that is that the nature of recall may actively alter your ability to remember it. And to show you the reconstructive nature of memory, I'm going to give you a particular challenge, and I challenge you to tell me the following. Was the doorknob going into your house on the right or the left on the door you most often used in the house that you lived in 3 houses back? Not your current one, not the last one, the previous one. Was that doorknob on the left or the right? And I dare say that you've never been asked that question before. I very much doubt your boyfriend or girlfriend rushed up to you and said, "No, wait a minute, on the house you lived in..." The point is that what you did, I can describe for you. You essentially described the elements of that door that you remember, and in fact you extracted from that the information that you needed. But what's demonstrated there is the reconstructive nature of memory itself, that you're pulling together the things that you know. In my own instance, I remember, as I heard several of you mumble, right-hand side. Well, in my case, I know it was because in that house, you had to walk up about 3 stairs. So you came up to the front of the house, the stairs went up beside the front. So you walked up beside the houses to your right as you walk up the stairs, and you turned this way. But the door opened this way. The screen door opened this way. It opened out against the part of the porch you wouldn't normally use, and therefore the doorknob was on the right because that other door swung inward. Not that that's relevant. I'll have a test item on it, but it isn't relevant. But the point is that in order to answer that question, that was the kind of recall sequence that I had to go through. I had to reconstruct the environment from which you could then pull the other information, which leads us then into another study, perhaps the classic in this field, done by Beth Loftus. And in essence, she did a study in which college students were shown an accident. Okay, I thought I had an image of it. I don't, so I'm going to have to talk a minute before I can show you the data. But in essence, what she did was to film a minor fender bender kind of accident on college campus at a familiar intersection. And she showed the information, okay? Showed the accident, about a 30 or 40 second film clip. She came back to herself talking to them, talked to them for 30 seconds or a minute, a couple of minutes of information to dull the memory slightly. And then she asked them a question, a series of questions on a pad of paper. They were given a pamphlet or a booklet, a stapled together booklet. The beauty of this is that you could ask different questions of the same subjects without interfering with anybody else. They'd all watched the same accident. They were asked a series of very different questions. And the answers that they got were instructive in a couple of different instances. The one is that in essence, if they were asked a question, among others, how fast were the cars going when they verbed? The verb differed on each questionnaire. So for some subjects, the verb was how fast were the cars going when they smashed? That word, among all the different verbs that were used, generated the highest speed estimate. For subjects asked that particular question, the speed estimate was almost 41 miles an hour of the same accident viewed by others. Other people, so this is clearly the kind of image that they must have had of that accident. But in any case, when you are asked collided, bumped, or hit, you get a decreasing speed estimate all the way down to contacted, which among the words that were used turned out to be the least evocative of high speed estimate. And look at that data. In that case, the high violence verb smashed generated a 41 mile an hour estimate. The neutral verb contacted, which really isn't very descriptive of contact between two cars, is 32 miles an hour. That has knocked fully 20% off the speed estimate. That's what you hire a lawyer for. Okay? And what's clearly demonstrated there is the very nature of the question that you ask influences the nature of the recall. What she's been able to demonstrate there, and what the field has come to realize, is that memory itself is a reconstructive process. Okay? Now you put that back, I'm going to veer off here for just a second, simply to tie it back to something that we did already talk about earlier, and that is, remember back to the study that was done on the injection of glucose. In that case, increasing the activity level. It increased the likelihood of being able to remember. And in a word that elicits more violence internally, just the image of a violent smashing accident, it tends to accelerate, influence the nature of the recall itself. Even more devastating in this kind of accident, we'll go back to the figures here now, this is obviously the contacted person's vision of the accident itself. One of the questions that was asked of the people who'd viewed this was simply the following: did you see any broken glass at the scene of the accident? And this is really where the power of this study really comes in, because this question was asked a week later. Okay? See the accident, record your initial impressions. A week later, they were brought back and asked a follow-up series, among which was, did you see any broken glass? And look at the difference in data. Okay? In terms of percentage of people reporting broken glass, a week later, more than twice as many people reported seeing broken glass at the scene of that accident then reported it when they were asked a neutral question about the accident a week ago. So the very act of trying to recall your memory of an accident when asked about cars smashing into each other doubles, more than doubles, your report or memory of broken glass. Okay? Very compelling evidence against eyewitness testimony in and of itself. So the question then is, well, okay, what do we do about it? Well, it turns out there are several things I wanted to get over here, and I didn't have time to do the visuals right at the end. But in essence, the question can be answered, and that is essentially, what do we do about eyewitness testimony? There was an article in the American Psychologist in 2001 by Casson, Tubb, Hosch, and Menon, in which Experts on eyewitness testimony were asked a series of questions, such as, is wording of questions important to the recall of information? 98% agreed that it was. Does review of mugshots intro a bias in later lineups? 95% said yes, it does. Does hypnosis influence the recall content? Aid recall, 91% said yes. What about the accuracy of hypnotically aided recall? Only 45% would endorse the accuracy of that information. How about accuracy in recalling a violent event? 37% would believe testimony based on that kind of an effect. I've commented earlier that if somebody sticks a gun in your face, you're concentrating on the gun, not who's holding it, okay? How do we do it better? That was the subject of a study. Actually, the results precede the reason for having them. But in essence, one group in 1985 reported a study where they had hypnotized and non-hypnotized subjects viewing a 4-minute film of a violent crime, okay? 3 independent interviewing techniques were used 2 days later. The one was a standard police technique. The problem with that is essentially it asks many closed-ended questions. It frequently interrupts the witness. It features questions in an inflexible order, which are simply non-adjusted to the answers that subjects give. Hypnotic interview actually led people to recall the information equally as well as those that were in a cognitive interview, which is now the preferred approach. And what that does is to ask subjects reinstate the context of the violence first, report everything without judging it, whether it's trivial or not, recall the events in different orders, more than once, but different orders. And finally, recall the incidents from different perspectives, the criminal's, yours, and so forth. All of those are now covered in nationally recommended interviewing procedures. We can, with eyewitness testimony and a knowledge of psychology, improve the accuracy of our recall. Thank you. We'll pick up on memory procedures in the next lecture.